Alistair Van Doren wasn't used to losing control. In boardrooms he spoke and people listened. In meetings his word was often the last. Even at home, where chaos usually ruled with a newborn, he'd installed smart cribs, white noise machines, and hired a night nurse just to keep things running smoothly. But none of that mattered now. Not here, not at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, with his 6-month-old daughter screaming like the world was ending. Elise had started crying the moment the cabin doors sealed shut. Not the usual fussy whimper that came before a nap or after a feed. This was different. This was raw, desperate, and unrelenting. Her face turned red, her tiny fists clenched, and her cries cut through the hum of the jet engines like a siren. Alistair tried everything he could think of. He checked her diaper, dry, offered her bottle. She turned her head away, rocked her gently in his arms. She arched her back and screamed louder. He even pulled out the noise-canceling headphones he'd bought specifically for this trip, the ones that played ocean waves and soft piano music. She yanked them off with surprising strength and let out a wail that made the woman in front of them flinch. He felt sweat gather at the back of his neck. This wasn't just about comfort anymore, it was about dignity. He'd booked first class, of course. Leather seats, privacy dividers, champagne on request. He'd wanted Elise to have the best, especially since her mother was still recovering from surgery and couldn't make the trip. But now, surrounded by people who probably recognized him, venture capitalists, journalists, maybe even a celebrity or two, he felt exposed. Like everyone could see right through his tailored suit and expensive watch to the truth. He was just a man, utterly helpless in the face of his own child's distress. A flight attendant approached with a practiced smile. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, voice low but eyes scanning Elise with concern. "She won't stop crying," Alistair admitted, voice tight. "I've tried everything. Sometimes babies just need time," the attendant said gently. "Or a change of scenery. Would you like to walk her up and down the aisle?" He nodded, grateful for the suggestion, and stood, cradling Elise against his chest. As he paced the narrow corridor between the plush seats, he caught glimpses of passengers pretending not to stare. Some looked sympathetic. Others, well, he could read their thoughts clearly enough. Why didn't he bring help? Why is he doing this alone? He wanted to snap back that he was trying, that he loved his daughter more than anything, that he hadn't slept more than 2 hours straight in weeks. But he stayed quiet. What good would it do? Back in his seat, Elise's cries had softened slightly, but only because she was exhausted. Her eyes were puffy, her breathing ragged. He held her close, whispering nonsense words into her hair, hoping his voice might soothe her the way it sometimes did at home. But the plane was too loud, too bright, too unfamiliar. She needed her mother, and he couldn't give her that. Across the aisle, unnoticed in the quiet rhythm of the cabin, sat a boy who couldn't have looked more different from Alistair if he tried. 15 years old with a faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers, he kept his eyes down, fingers tracing the frayed edge of his duffel bag. His name was Deshaun, and he was flying alone for the first time, not to a luxury destination but to Manchester where his father lived. They hadn't seen each other since Deshaun was 8. His ticket had been paid for by a scholarship he'd won after building a solar-powered phone charger out of old laptop parts and copper wire from a junkyard. The trip wasn't glamorous. He'd packed 2 changes of clothes, a notebook full of circuit diagrams, and a small photo of his grandmother, who'd raised him and his twin sisters after their mom passed. Deshaun had been watching the scene unfold with quiet attention, not out of curiosity but out of recognition. That cry, high-pitched, panicked, endless, wasn't new to him. He'd heard it in the middle of the night in the shelter where they'd stayed after the flood. He'd heard it when the power went out for 3 days during the winter storm, and his sisters were cold and scared. Babies didn't cry like that because they were spoiled or difficult. They cried because they were lost, because the world felt too big, too loud, too strange. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer advice. He knew better than to speak up in a space like this, first class where people like him were rarely seen unless they were serving drinks or cleaning trays. But as Elise's cries started up again, sharper this time, something in him stirred. He remembered his grandmother's voice, low and steady, humming as she rocked his sisters to sleep on the porch during thunderstorms. No words, just sound. Warm, rhythmic, safe. Without thinking too much about it, Deshaun leaned forward just slightly and began to hum. It wasn't loud. It wasn't showy. just a soft, wordless tune that rose and fell like a breath. He kept his eyes on his lap, pretending to fiddle with the zipper of his bag as if the sound were accidental. But it wasn't, it was deliberate. A quiet offering, and then something shifted. Elise's cries hitched. Her head turned just a fraction toward the sound. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a different rhythm. The raw panic in her eyes softened, replaced by something like curiosity. She let out a small whimper, then another, quieter one, and then slowly her eyelids began to droop. Alistair froze. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't rocked her, fed her, or played music. He'd just been holding her, feeling more useless by the second. But now she was calming. Not all at once, but steadily, like a storm passing. He looked around, confused. Who had made that sound? His eyes landed on the boy across the aisle. Deshaun hadn't moved. He was still looking down, but his lips were barely parted, and the hum, faint but steady, was still there. Alistair's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. Gratitude? Confusion? Embarrassment? All of it tangled together. He watched as Elise's breathing evened out, her little body going slack against his chest. Within minutes she was asleep. Really asleep. Not the fitful dozing she'd been managing before. The cabin seemed to exhale. The tension that had built with every cry dissolved into a quiet hum of relief. A few passengers exchanged glances. One older woman gave Deshaun a small, knowing smile. No one clapped. No one made a scene. But something had changed, not just for Elise, but for everyone who'd been holding their breath along with her. Alistair looked down at his daughter. Her face peaceful now, cheeks still damp but no longer twisted in distress. Then he looked back at the boy. "Thank you," he said, voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite name. Deshaun finally met his eyes. There was no pride in his gaze, no expectation of reward, just quiet understanding. "Babies don't care how much your shoes cost," he said simply. "They just want to feel safe." The words hit Alistair harder than he expected. He'd spent years building a life where safety was guaranteed. Gated homes, private schools, emergency protocols for everything. But in that moment, safety wasn't about money or security systems. It was about a voice in the dark. A presence that said, "You're not alone." He nodded, unable to speak. And for the first time in a long time, Alistair Van Doren didn't feel like a millionaire. He just felt like a father, grateful, humbled, and suddenly aware of how much he still had to learn. The silence that followed was almost as startling as the crying had been. Elise slept deeply now, her tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her fingers curled loosely around the collar of Alistair's shirt. Around them, the cabin settled back into its usual rhythm. The soft clink of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the occasional rustle of a blanket. But Alistair couldn't relax. His mind was racing, replaying what had just happened. That hum, so simple, so ordinary, had done in seconds what all his money, planning, and gadgets couldn't manage in nearly 2 hours. He kept glancing across the aisle. The boy hadn't moved much. He sat with his back straight, eyes on the window, watching clouds drift past like slow-motion thoughts. There was a quiet dignity about him that Alistair found hard to ignore. He wasn't seeking attention. He hadn't even looked over after Elise fell asleep. It was as if he'd offered something precious and then stepped back. Letting it speak for itself, Alistair shifted in his seat. Careful not to jostle Elise, he wanted to say more. To ask something, anything, but he didn't know how to start. What do you say to someone who just calmed your child with nothing but a sound from his heart? "Thanks again," he finally offered, voice lower this time. The boy turned slightly. "It's okay," he said. "She just needed to hear something familiar." "Familiar?" Alistair asked, surprised. "But you've never met her." "Doesn't matter," the boy replied. "Babies don't need words. They need rhythm, warmth, like when the rain taps on a roof, or someone's footsteps on the porch. It tells them someone's there." Alistair blinked. He'd never thought of it that way. He'd always assumed crying was about hunger, discomfort, or fatigue. Things you could fix with a bottle or a clean diaper. But this was about presence, about connection. And suddenly he felt a pang of guilt. How many nights had he handed Elise off to the night nurse because he had an early meeting? How many times had he checked his phone while rocking her, half listening, half planning his next move? The boy seemed to sense his thoughts. "You love her," he said simply, not as a question but as a fact. That's what matters most. Alistair swallowed. I do. More than anything. He hesitated. I'm Alistair, by the way. And this is Elise. Deshawn, the boy said, offering a small nod. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the kind that didn't feel awkward but almost companionable. Outside, the sky deepened into twilight, streaks of orange and purple bleeding across the horizon. A flight attendant came by with dinner trays, and Alistair accepted his with a quiet thanks, balancing it carefully on the fold-out table while keeping one arm around Elise. Deshawn got a standard economy meal, plastic-wrapped, modest, but he ate slowly, thoughtfully, as if each bite mattered. Alistair noticed the careful way he folded the wrapper before setting it aside, the way he saved the bread roll for last. These weren't habits of someone used to abundance. They were habits of someone who knew what it meant to go without. You traveling alone? Alistair asked gently. Yeah, Deshawn said. Got a scholarship to a tech camp in Manchester. Summer program for kids who build stuff. Build stuff? Alistair leaned in slightly, intrigued. Like what? Deshawn shrugged, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. Last year I made a phone charger that runs on sunlight. Used old laptop batteries, some copper wire, and a little solar panel I found in a dumpster behind a repair shop. Hooked it all together with tape and prayers, pretty much. Alistair stared. You built a solar charger. From scrap? Yeah, it's not fancy, but it works. Charged my sister's phone for a whole week during the blackout. That's incredible, Alistair said, and he meant it. He'd built his first app in a garage, coding through the night on a second-hand laptop. He remembered that hunger, the drive to create something from nothing to prove you could. But he'd never had to scavenge parts from a dumpster. How'd you learn to do that? Grandma taught me to fix things, Deshawn said softly. Said if you can't buy it, learn to make it. And if you can't make it, help someone who can. He paused. She passed last winter. Alistair felt a lump form in his throat. I'm sorry. Deshawn nodded, eyes back on the window. She used to hum like that when storms came. Said sound could hold you together when everything else fell apart. Alistair looked down at Elise, sleeping peacefully. He thought about his own childhood. Comfortable, structured, full of tutors and summer camps, but not much humming. His parents had been kind but distant, always busy building their own empire. He'd learned early that love often came wrapped in expectations, not lullabies. The meal ended, and the cabin lights dimmed further. Most passengers put on eye masks or settled into sleep. But Alistair and Deshawn stayed awake, talking in low voices. Deshawn told him about the tech camp, about how he'd never been on a plane before, about how nervous he was to meet his dad again after all these years. Alistair listened, really listened, not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man who suddenly saw the world through a different lens. At one point, Elise stirred in her sleep, letting out a small whimper. Before Alistair could react, Deshawn leaned forward again and hummed, just two soft notes, barely audible. Instantly, Elise settled back down. How do you know that works? Alistair asked, amazed. Because I've been the one crying too, Deshawn said quietly. When the lights went out, when Grandma got sick, when I didn't know if we'd have food the next day, sometimes all you need is to know someone's near, even if they don't say a word. Alistair felt something shift inside him, something deep and long ignored. He'd spent his life solving problems with money, with systems, with power. But here was a boy who solved them with presence, with memory, with a voice that carried love across silence. Later, when turbulence jostled the plane, Deshawn instinctively reached out and steadied Elise's bassinet with one hand, his movements calm and sure. Alistair watched him, the calluses on his palms, the faded ink of a doodle on his wrist, the way his eyes never lost their focus, even in uncertainty. You're going to do great things, Alistair said, not as flattery, but as a quiet certainty. Deshawn smiled faintly. Maybe. But right now I just want to see if my dad remembers how to braid hair. He used to do it for me and my sisters when we were little. The simplicity of that wish, so human, so tender, struck Alistair harder than any business deal ever had. He realized then that wealth wasn't just about what you owned, but what you were willing to give without expecting anything back. And this boy, with his second-hand clothes and his heart full of songs, had already given more in 1 hour than Alistair had in months. As the plane cruised through the night, stars glittering above like scattered promises, Alistair held his daughter a little tighter, and for the first time, he didn't think about schedules or meetings or investments. He just thought about sound, about safety, about the quiet, unstoppable power of one human being reaching out to another, across seats, across lives, across everything that usually kept people apart. The plane hit a patch of rough air just after midnight. Not dangerous, just enough to rattle the overhead bins and make the seatbelt sign chime softly. Alistair tensed instinctively, one hand going to Elise's bassinet, the other gripping the armrest. But before he could even adjust her blanket, Deshawn's hand was there, steady, quiet, pressing down gently on the edge of the bassinet to keep it from rocking too much. It wasn't showy. It wasn't asked for. It was just there, like he'd done it 100 times before, and maybe he had. Alistair watched him for a long moment. The way Deshawn didn't flinch at the turbulence, the way his eyes stayed calm even as the cabin lights flickered. This wasn't someone used to smooth rides and cushioned landings. This was someone who'd learned to hold things together when the ground shook beneath him, literally and otherwise. "You've done this before," Alistair said, not as a question. Deshawn gave a small nod. "Yeah. Used to sleep on buses with my sisters when we moved around a lot. Every bump felt like the end of the world to them. I'd hold the seat in front and hum until they stopped shaking." Alistair felt a quiet ache in his chest. He thought about his own childhood, private school, summer homes, a nanny who sang lullabies in perfect pitch. He'd never known what it was like to fear a bus ride. He'd never had to be the one holding things together for someone smaller than him. Until now, maybe. But even now, he'd needed help. They sat in silence for a while, the plane leveling out, the hum of the engines returning to their steady drone. Outside, the sky was endless black, dotted with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Inside, something unspoken had settled between them. Not friendship, not yet, but a kind of understanding. Two people from different worlds brought together by a crying baby and a song without words. Alistair found himself wanting to know more. Not out of pity, not out of curiosity like he was studying a case file, but because Deshawn's presence made him see his own life differently, like looking in a mirror that showed not what he had but what he'd missed. "How'd you learn to build things?" he asked softly. Deshawn leaned back, fingers tracing the seam of his duffel bag. Grandma's house was always falling apart. Roof leaked, fridge made weird noises. Lights flickered like ghosts were playing with the switches. She'd say, "If you wait for someone to fix it, you'll be waiting forever." So I started watching YouTube videos on my sister's cracked phone. Took things apart, put them back together. Sometimes they worked better. Sometimes they didn't work at all. But she never got mad. She'd just say, "At least you tried." He smiled faintly. That meant more than "good job." Alistair thought about the engineers in his company, brilliant minds with degrees from top schools, working in labs with million-dollar equipment. And here was a kid who'd learned circuitry from a broken fridge and a grandmother's faith. "You ever think about doing this for a living?" Alistair asked. "Engineering, design, building real things." Deshawn shrugged. "I don't know. I like making stuff that helps people. Like that charger, it wasn't about being cool. It was about my sister needing to call her teacher, or my grandma needing to reach the clinic. If I can build things that keep people connected, that's enough for me." Alistair nodded slowly. He'd built his empire on disruption, on scaling fast, on winning. But this was different. This was about care disguised as creation. Elise stirred again, letting out a soft coo. Her eyes fluttered open, not crying this time, just looking. She turned her head toward Deshawn as if drawn to him. He met her gaze and, without thinking, made a quiet clicking sound with his tongue, the kind people make to get a baby's attention. Elise blinked, then gurgled, a tiny smile forming on her lips. Alistair laughed softly. "She likes you." "Nah," Deshawn said, but he was smiling too. "She just knows I'm not going to drop her." That simple sentence hung in the air. Not going to drop her. Not going to walk away. Not going to outsource her care to someone else. Alistair realized how rare that kind of promise was in his world, where everything, even love, could be delegated. He thought about the smart crib that monitored Elise's breathing, the AI app that analyzed her cries, the team of experts on call 24/7, all of it designed to keep her safe. And yet none of it had calmed her like a boy humming a tune his grandmother taught him. "You know, Alistair said slowly. I've spent so much time making sure she has everything. I forgot to just be there. Deshaun didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at Alistair, really looked at him and said, You're here now. That counts. It was such a small thing to say, but it landed like a gift. Not judgment, not advice, just acknowledgement. You're here now, and maybe that was enough to start. As the hours passed, they talked more. About school, about dreams, about the strange loneliness of being responsible for someone else's happiness. Deshaun spoke of his twin sisters with a mix of pride and worry. They're smart, he said. Smarter than me. But they don't believe it yet. I keep telling them, you don't need permission to be brilliant. But it's hard when the world keeps telling you you're less. Alistair felt that deeply. He'd faced doubters too early on, people who said his ideas were too risky, too naive. But he'd had safety nets, savings accounts, family connections, second chances. Deshaun had none of that. Just grit, memory, and a belief that kindness could be a kind of technology too. When the flight attendants came around with warm towels and water, Alistair noticed how Deshaun accepted his with both hands. Said thank you like it meant something. No entitlement. Just gratitude for the small things. Later, during a quiet stretch of the flight, Deshaun pulled out his notebook. Not a sleek tablet, but a spiral-bound pad with smudged pencil drawings of circuits. Solar panels, even a rough sketch of a music box. I want to build one that plays lullabies, he said, showing Alistair. For kids in shelters. Something they can hold when it's dark. Alistair studied the drawing. It was simple, elegant, full of heart. You could patent that, he said. Turn it into a real product. Deshaun shook his head. Now patents cost money. Lawyers cost more. I just want to teach other kids how to make them. So they don't have to wait for someone to save them. That hit Alistair harder than he expected, because that's what he'd been doing his whole life. Waiting for the right moment, the right deal, the right person to make things happen. But Deshaun wasn't waiting. He was already building. As dawn began to lighten the horizon, a soft gray bleeding into gold, Elise woke fully, babbling happily, reaching out with her little hands. Alistair fed her, changed her, played with her toes, and for the first time in days he wasn't thinking about efficiency or schedules. He was just present, watching her eyes light up at the sight of a passing cloud, laughing when she grabbed his nose, and every so often she'd glance toward Deshaun, as if checking that he was still there. He was. And when the plane began its slow descent into London, Alistair knew something had changed, not just for Elise but for him. He'd come on this trip thinking he was in control, but the truth was he'd been lost, and a quiet boy with a worn duffel bag and a heart full of songs had shown him the way back, not with grand gestures, but with the simplest, most human thing of all showing up. Now, as the wheels touched down and the cabin buzzed with the rustle of seatbelts and gathering belongings, Alistair looked at Deshaun and knew he couldn't just say goodbye at baggage claim. Not after this, not after everything that had passed between them in the sky. Because sometimes the most important meetings don't happen in boardrooms. They happen at 35,000 feet, in the space between a cry and a hum, between two lives that were never supposed to cross, but did anyway. And in that crossing something new was born. Not a deal, not a transaction, but a possibility, a bridge, a beginning. The plane taxied to a stop and the cabin buzzed with the familiar sounds of seatbelts clicking open, overhead bins snapping shut, and passengers stretching after hours in the air. Alistair held Elise against his chest, watching as Deshaun carefully zipped his duffel bag, his movements calm and deliberate. There was no rush in him, no nervous energy, just quiet readiness. He was heading into the unknown, to a city he'd never seen, to a father he barely remembered, with nothing but a scholarship letter and a notebook full of dreams. Alistair knew he couldn't let this end at the jetway. As people began to file out, he stood and gently touched Deshaun's shoulder. "Wait a moment," he said. "I'd like to talk." Deshaun paused, eyes curious but not surprised, as if he'd sensed something was coming. He nodded and stepped aside, letting the crowd flow past them like a river around a stone. Alistair took a breath. He wasn't used to speaking from the heart without a plan, without bullet points or a pitch deck. But this wasn't business. This was something else entirely. "I've been thinking," he began, voice low, "about what you said. About building things that help people, about teaching kids to make their own way. That matters, more than you know. Deshawn looked at him, waiting. I run a foundation, Alistair continued. We fund tech education, innovation labs, mentorship programs across Europe and the US. What you're doing, what you want to do, it fits. Perfectly. He hesitated, then plunged forward. I'd like to offer you a full internship at our Manchester Innovation Lab this summer. Housing included, stipend, mentorship from our lead engineers, and a path to a long-term role if you want it. He watched Deshawn's face closely, expecting excitement, maybe disbelief. But instead the boy's expression grew thoughtful, almost cautious. That's generous, Deshawn said slowly. But I don't want charity. It's not charity, Alistair said quickly. It's investment. In someone who already knows how to turn scraps into solutions. Who understands that technology isn't just about speed or profit. It's about people. Deshawn looked down at his shoes, scuffed at the toes, laces frayed from use. I appreciate it, he said, really. But I've seen how these things go. People give you a hand up, then expect you to be grateful forever, to act a certain way, to forget where you came from. Alistair felt the truth in those words like a punch. He'd done that himself, hired talent from diverse backgrounds, then expected them to fit neatly into his world without questioning it. He'd never considered that help could feel like a cage if it came with invisible strings. You're right, he admitted. Too often opportunity comes with conditions. But I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to bring exactly what you are, the Hummer, the builder, the brother, to a place that needs it. Deshawn studied him for a long moment. Then quietly he asked, what if I want to teach other kids? The ones back home? The ones who'll never get a scholarship or step foot in a lab like that? Alistair didn't hesitate. Then we'll make space for that too. You design the program. You run the workshops. We fund the materials, the travel, the outreach. Call it whatever you want. It's yours. A flicker of something, hope maybe, passed through Deshawn's eyes. But he wasn't done. One condition, he said, name it. I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about them. The kids, no press. No photos of me, the inspiring poor kid. Just hands building, voices learning, hearts feeling like they belong. Alistair smiled. Done. They stood there for a moment, the noise of the airport fading into the background. Around them, families reunited. Business travelers checked phones, luggage rolled by on carts. But in that small space between two seats, something real had taken root. Then Deshawn did something unexpected. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully. It was the music box he'd sketched on the plane. Made from a tin can, a rubber band, a few gears salvaged from an old clock, and a tiny strip of metal that played a soft, wobbly version of the lullaby he'd hummed. I made this last week, he said, holding it out. For my sisters, but I think Elise should have it. Alistair took it gently. The metal was warm from being tucked close to Deshawn's body. He wound the little key on the side and the tune began. Simple, imperfect, achingly beautiful. Elise reached for it, her eyes wide with wonder. She'll keep it safe, Alistair said, voice thick. Deshawn nodded. Tell her it's not magic. It's just someone saying, I'm here. At baggage claim, they stood side by side watching the carousel spin. Alistair's sleek suitcase appeared first, followed by Deshawn's worn duffel, looking out of place among the designer luggage. A driver Alistair had called earlier waited nearby, holding a sign with Deshawn's name. You'll be taken straight to the lab housing, Alistair said. They'll have everything you need. And if you change your mind about anything at all, you call me directly. No gatekeepers. Deshawn shouldered his bag. Thank you, he said. For listening? No, Alistair replied. Thank you. For reminding me what really matters. Just then, Elise let out a happy squeal and reached toward Deshawn with both arms. Without thinking, he stepped closer and let her tiny fingers grasp his thumb. She gurgled, smiling that toothless all-in smile only babies can give. Deshawn's face softened. You take care of her, he said. I will, Alistair promised. And I'll make sure she grows up knowing that kindness doesn't come from bank accounts. It comes from people like you. Deshawn gave a small, almost shy nod. Then he turned and walked toward the waiting car, his step steady, his head high. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. Something had already been passed between them, something that couldn't be undone. Later, in the back of his own town car heading into London, Alistair held the music box in one hand and Elise in the other. She was dozing again, her breath warm against his neck. He wound the box once more and the lullaby filled the quiet space. A humble melody made from scraps carrying a message older than money, older than titles, older than fear. He thought about the foundation's board meetings, the glossy brochures, the metrics and KPIs. And he realized, none of it meant anything if it didn't lead to moments like this, where a boy with nothing but a song in his heart could calm a storm and change a life. By the time they reached the hotel, Alistair had already drafted an email to his team. Subject line, New Initiative, the Hummingbird Project. He didn't explain the name. He didn't need to. Those who'd been in that cabin would understand. And those who hadn't, they would learn. Because real change didn't start with grand announcements. It started with a hum in the dark, a hand reaching across an aisle, a choice to see someone, not for what they lacked, but for what they carried inside. And as he tucked Elise into the hotel crib, placing the little music box beside her, Alistair whispered the same tune Deshawn had sung, soft, steady, full of promise. Not because he was good at it, but because he was trying, and sometimes that was enough to begin. 6 months had passed since that flight, and the world hadn't changed overnight, but something quiet had taken root, like a seed pushing through cracked concrete. In a sunlit community center on the edge of Manchester, a group of kids sat cross-legged on the floor, wires and circuit boards spread out before them like puzzle pieces. At the front of the room stood Deshawn, sleeves rolled up, voice calm as he explained how to connect a small solar panel to a recycled speaker. His hands moved with confidence now, but his eyes still held that same gentle watchfulness, the kind that noticed when someone was struggling, but too shy to ask. This wasn't just a tech workshop. It was a sanctuary. Kids from refugee families, from overcrowded flats, from homes where electricity was a luxury and peace was rare. They came here not just to build, but to belong. And what they were building today was special. Music boxes. Not fancy ones, not store-bought, but ones they designed themselves, using old tin cans, broken headphones, bits of plastic, and tiny motors salvaged from discarded toys. Each box would play a lullaby, some in Arabic, some in Somali, some in Polish, some in English. Songs their mothers and grandmothers used to sing back home. Deshawn called it the Hummingbird Project, though he never told anyone why. He didn't need to. The name lived in the way the kids leaned in when he spoke, in the way they stayed late to help clean up, in the way they hugged their finished boxes like treasures. Across the room, near the back, Alistair stood quietly holding Elise's hand. She was walking now, steady on her feet, her curiosity as boundless as the sky. She tugged his hand toward a boy her age who was carefully gluing a gear into place. The boy looked up, startled, then offered a shy smile. Elise plopped down beside him without hesitation and began handing him screws from a small tray. Alistair watched, heart full. This was nothing like the polished innovation labs his company was known for. No glass walls, no holograms, no press photographers. Just a room with peeling paint, second-hand chairs, and children learning that their hands could create beauty, even from broken things. He hadn't come as a donor. Not today. He'd come as a father, and as a student. After the session ended, Deshawn walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked older, not in years, but in presence. The uncertainty that had shadowed him on the plane was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty that came from being trusted, from making a difference. "She's growing fast," Deshawn said, nodding at Elise, who was now trying to wind a music box with comical seriousness. "Too fast," Alistair replied, smiling. "She asks for you sometimes. Calls you the Hummer," Deshawn chuckled. "Guess I left an impression." "You did more than that," Alistair said. "You changed how I see everything." They stepped outside, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the courtyard. A few kids lingered, showing their parents their finished music boxes, faces glowing with pride. One little girl played hers for her mother, who listened with tears in her eyes, whispering the words along with the tune. Alistair turned to Deshawn. "Your dad? How's that going?" Deshawn's expression softened. "Better than I thought. He's trying. We're learning each other again. He even came to one of the workshops last week. Didn't say much, but he stayed the whole time. Helped a kid solder a wire." He paused. "Turns out he used to fix radios when he was young." Guess it runs in the family, Alistair nodded. Sometimes healing didn't come in big speeches or dramatic reunions. Sometimes it came in silence and shared tasks, in the simple act of showing up. Back inside, Elise had found Deshawn's original music box, the one he'd given her on the plane, and was holding it like a sacred object. She wound it carefully, and the familiar lullaby filled the air, wobbly but warm. The other kids turned toward the sound, some smiling, some humming along. She remembers it, Deshawn said, surprised. She's heard it every night since we got home, Alistair admitted. It's her favorite. Better than all the smart toys, all the apps. Just that little tune. Because it's real, Deshawn said simply. It's not made by a machine. It's made by someone who cared enough to try. That was the heart of it, Alistair realized. In a world obsessed with perfection, flawless code, seamless design, instant results, what people truly craved was authenticity. A voice that trembled but kept singing, a hand that shook but still reached out, a song built from scraps but full of soul. Later, as they prepared to leave, Elise walked over to Deshawn and held out her arms. He knelt and she hugged him tightly, her little face pressed against his shoulder. No words, just presence, just trust. When they pulled away, she placed the music box in his hands. For your sisters, she said, clear as day, the first full sentence she'd ever spoken to someone outside the family. Deshawn's eyes glistened. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then he whispered, "Thank you, little light." On the drive back to London, Elise fell asleep in her car seat, thumb in her mouth, a faint smile on her lips. Alistair looked at her, then out the window at the passing streets, ordinary, messy, alive. He thought about the board meetings he'd canceled to be here, the emails he'd ignored, the deals that could wait. None of it mattered as much as this. Raising a child who knew that kindness wasn't measured in wealth, but in willingness. Back home, he updated the foundation's website. No press release. No fanfare. Just a new page titled The Hummingbird Project, with photos of kids building, laughing, sharing. At the bottom, a simple line. Technology is not just what we build, it's how we care. Months later, similar workshops began popping up in cities across Europe and the US, not funded by flashy campaigns, but by teachers, community leaders, and former participants who'd been touched by that first music box. Some used solar panels, some used hand cranks, some just used voices, but all of them carried the same message. You are not alone. And though the story never made headlines, it traveled in quieter ways. In a lullaby hummed in a shelter in Berlin, in a tin can speaker playing a grandmother's song in Chicago, in a father learning to braid his daughter's hair again in Manchester. Alistair still ran his company. Deshawn still built things from scraps. Elise still loved her music box. But something had shifted in the space between them. A recognition that the most powerful connections aren't forged in boardrooms or bank accounts, but in moments of raw, unguarded humanity, like a baby crying on a plane, like a boy humming in the dark, like a choice to listen, really listen, not with your ears, but with your heart. And in a world that often feels divided, that choice remains the most revolutionary act of all.